Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today, and thank you for coming. 1 year ago, I had the privilege to be here with you in Singapore for the inaugural Hack in the Box GSEC conference, and to present a research on extortion and cooperation in the zero-day market through the lens of game theory. I present this research also to other audience later in here and listen to their comments and thoughts. Most notably, a colleague in Japan asked me what I thought about the ethical dilemmas related to the disclosure of vulnerabilities and the trading of vulnerability information, and if those questions were meaningless to me. While they are far from being meaningless to me, at that time, I sidestepped providing to this friend a satisfactory answer because my research was focused on the economics of vulnerability markets, and I was not into this business. Hence, I suggest that there are different sensibilities around the world when it comes to the ethical dilemmas related to vulnerability information, and if we work towards aligning the incentives in the industry, we would have in turn led to business practices of higher ethicality. Later, and after careful consideration, I decided to go from theory to practice, and I entered the space. But in so doing, the ethical questions related to the trade of vulnerability information could not be postponed any further. In fact, zero-day vulnerabilities, weaknesses in software or hardware unknown to the parties who can mitigate their specific negative effects, are gaining a prominent role in modern-day intelligence, national security, and law enforcement operations. At the same time, the lack of transparency and accountability in their trade and adoption, the possible overexploitation or abuse, the latent conflict of interest by the parties handling them, and their potential double effects may pose societal risk and may lead to the breach of human rights. If left unaddressed, these usage-related challenges call into question the legitimacy of zero-day vulnerabilities as enablers of national security and law enforcement operations, and erode the benefits that their proportionate use have for the judiciary, defense, and intelligence purposes. So, with your help, what I want to do today is to briefly review the vulnerability supply chain, its main actors, and their surrounding ethical questions. After setting the context, after setting the stage, I will share with you how I decided to approach these questions in my occupation and report on the ethical principles and standards I set forth in the Code of Business Ethics that I adopt in my day-to-day business operation. In doing so, it's not my intention neither to lecture anybody about how you are expected to behave, nor to provide definitive answer to compelling challenges. I will be happy if I will have asked more questions than given answers, and if I will have contributed some principles and standards to build upon. So let's get started. How many of you are familiar with the Philip K. Dick 1968 novel, Do Android Dream, or Electric Sheep? Anyone? Great. And how many of you are familiar with the Ridley Scott 1982 film, Blade Runner? Very well. The story I want to tell you today is the story that finds inspiration in a science fiction novel. And as we are about to overtake the moment in time in which the novel is set, inform us about the present we're living, some of the ethical questions arises, and how I decided to approach them in my occupation. Shortly, I will introduce you the dramatis personae of our story. Their story is the story of the vulnerability supply chain, composed, among others, of software makers creating vulnerabilities during the product development lifecycle, researchers finding existing vulnerabilities and creating exploits to take advantage of them, brokers trading vulnerability intelligence and zero-day exploits, and organizations using and sometimes misusing these capabilities. Their story is also our story. But it's my contention that wherever we turn our attention into the vulnerability supply chain, each and every industry actor face their respective ethical challenges related to the knowledge of zero-day vulnerabilities. But let's proceed in order, and let's try to draw a parallel between the fictional Anno Domini 2019 depicted in Blade Runner and the present we are living in. The Anno Domini 2019 depicted in Blade Runner is a time of societal decline, where technology has polluted the earth and seized control of the city. Enormous power is in the hands of corporations, and Los Angeles appears to have turned in one of the Jeremy Bentham panopticons, whereby one cannot tell if one is being watched, but it's possible that one is being watched at all times. Therefore, extreme caution needs to be exercised at all times. The roving spotlight present throughout the film suggests constant surveillance, and the replicants need to stay in character even when alone. This is what Harvard psychologist Shoshana Zuboff called in 1988 anticipatory conformity. Interestingly, though, surveillance is not the only point of contact between fiction and reality. Let's consider pollution. Yes, let's consider pollution because vulnerabilities are like pollutants. The private upfront cost of insecure software, as it happens for the cost of waste dumping, for instance, is near zero to most. The cost of insecure software is near zero for software makers. Yet the social cost of it is quite high. The social cost of insecure software is almost unbearable nowadays. That is to say that, as for today, software security is an externality, a negative externality, because the market does not provide significant or compelling incentives for developing secure software. As a result, software makers are practicing unrestrained vulnerability dumping onto the downstream market participants. This comes as no surprise, because building security into our products is in stark contrast with the ship, then test paradigm, or the don't worry, be crappy mantra advocated by entrepreneurs innovating the most. In an absence of a policy discouraging the unrestrained vulnerability dumping onto the downstream market participants, defenders are too busy mopping the floor in order to turn off the faucet. That is to say that the market participants, in doing patching, filtering, and protecting their system, will do little to stop the pollution that occurs upstream. Hence, poorly written, insecure software is not longer a technology issue. Poorly written, insecure software is a public policy issue. Software vulnerabilities leave consumers, business, national infrastructure, governments, and military vulnerable to attacks. Even worse, there's no such thing as a secure software, bug-free software, right? Every software of non-trivial complexity contains bugs. This means that we need to patch the software we entrust our business. We need to patch the software we rely upon. Yet patching plays as a perverse incentive, allowing software manufacturers to optimize market-legal protections by renegotiating contract terms buyers could not negotiate in the first place. This is how every time a vulnerability comes out, we find ourselves signing a new license agreement, but this gives the manufacturers the ability to renegotiate contract terms the user could not negotiate in the first place. So we have a choice. We have a take it or leave it choice. Either I set the new software license agreement and keep patching the software I rely upon in order to support my business, or I don't, and I risk exploitation. This is a deal I can't refuse, and neither can you. All of which is to say that corporate power is as much a key feature in Blade Runner as much a signature of our industry. And finally, as a final note of color, the slogan chosen by the Shimata Dominguez Corporation, helping America into a new world, is remarkably similar to the slogan chosen by Donald Trump for his campaign, Make America Great Again. Right. So meet Rick Descartes. Rick Descartes is a selfish, self-involved, specialist plainclothes ex-police officer, or an officially sanctioned bounty hunter. who goes after renegade androids, also known as Andes. Here surely is where the parallel breaks down. Officially or tacitly sanctioned, but the bounty hunters in the information security industry are certainly not faced with retiring 6 escape Nexus 6 androids, but we are after pollutants done by software makers upstream. We write code in order to constructively prove the risks related to the existence of those vulnerabilities. Organizations, both in the government and the industry sector, demand the findings of this research to enable their security strategies, and various types of marketplaces compete with each other in order to win the preference of bounty hunters towards the vulnerability disclosure policy of choice. So as I said, wherever we turn our attention in the vulnerability supply chain, from software makers to researcher to government agency, all industry actors face their respective ethical challenges related to the vulnerabilities affecting network device and the knowledge of their existence. Therefore, I want to ask you, who holds the moral low ground? The ruthless malefactors profiting from yet another remote code execution vulnerability, or vendors practicing unrestrained vulnerability dumping onto the downstream market participants? Who are the ones that exploit us the most? The foreign security services taking total control of our mobile assets, or vendors using patching to optimize market legal protections by renegotiating contract terms user could not negotiate in the first place, and from which the user had no satisfactory way to escape. If our governments introduce trade controls to administer the export of intrusion software, should we demand software manufacturers to internalize the cost of insecure software that we import into our lives for reason of symmetry? Should we make them liable for the defects and flaws that allow the intrusion in the first place? With incomplete knowledge about the real world security system we rely upon in order to support our business, is it even ethical to refrain us from hunting vulnerabilities or to prevent others from doing likewise? So, as already happened too many times in the past. And what should do a security researcher with a vulnerability when it gets found? Is full disclosure an acceptable course of action? Does full disclosure becomes more acceptable if the affected vendor ignores the vulnerabilities that were reported responsibly or fails to provide a timely patch? Does coordinated vulnerability disclosure provide a more ethically sound path to be taken? Does the same path remain morally preferable if one of the parties who received the vulnerability information from the coordinator prior to the public disclosure use this information to exploit vulnerable entities, as already happened to Carnegie Mellon University at the US CERT under subpoena by the feds in order to disclose the vulnerability affecting Tor? Are bug bounty programs exploiting bounty hunters if they pay only a fraction of the real market value for the same research? What are fair terms here? I'd like to share with you a data point to inform your conclusion. From today and up to November 30th, Zeronomicon is paying $200,000 US for a remote code execution vulnerability on Microsoft Outlook on the web. Of course, the vulnerability needs to be exclusive and reliable. And I will not dig into the terms and conditions, but I refer you to the website if interested. Moving further, should bug hunters pretend to get paid if one party has not asked them to do their work? If the other party has not invited them to do their work? And what government security agency should do with vulnerabilities? Should they exploit them, or should they let everybody else mitigate them in the way they already do? Should they take advantage of those vulnerabilities to benefit a limited number of stakeholders? Or should they disclose them to all affected constituents? As the power inequity in the vulnerability equation to be balanced, with entities affected by vulnerabilities spread all around the world, how to inform the public? With vendors threatening legal action and supported by their significant financial resources, how to protect the security researcher? With our society growing more data intensive, how to oversee not only material and technology, but also knowledge? How do the attempts to strike a balance between scientific openness and national security redefine science-security relation? And how does scientific knowledge become subject to security governance? How does this dynamic affect the links among scientific knowledge, security expertise, and political decision. And more importantly, can we regard hacking to be an ethical practice and condemn at the same time the trade of capabilities enabling this practice as immoral? Can we regard hacking to be an ethical practice and condemn at the same time the trade of capabilities enabling this practice as immoral? As an ethically concerned trader of vulnerability information and security capabilities, I established a code of business ethics, and I hold to these principles and standards in the conduct of my business. I set forth 6 principles and 8 corresponding ethical standards. The principles are aspirational goals, aim at guiding and inspiring the conduct of business, and they underpin the ethical standards. The ethical standards are enforceable rules for the day-to-day business operation. So let's give them a look. The first and foremost governing principle in the Code of Business Ethics that today I offer to the private sector is the clean hands principle, which asks the private sector and me to respect all human rights proclaiming international human rights treaties, including the International Bill of Human Rights, and strive to ensure no complicity whatsoever in any human rights abuses. Because it's not my ambition to be involved in any human rights abuses. Therefore, I vet and monitor my customers, and this is the first enforceable rule. I do so by not engaging in any business with entities known for abusing human rights, reserving the right to suspend or cease all business operation with entities found to be involved with human rights abuses at a later point in time. Building on this principle, principle number B, ask the private sector to do not pose a danger to human health. Ask the private sector to champion the health of human beings and to commit to not enable customers with capabilities that may pose a direct danger to the health of human beings. Therefore, we should not engage in any trade of capabilities that exploit vulnerabilities in medical devices or systems to which human life is entrusted, unless the vendor or the affected device or system is the acquiring entity, or the acquiring entity has been authorized by the vendor to be the recipient of the vulnerability disclosure process. Similarly, standard number 3, we shall never trade in stolen trade secrets and require our suppliers to certify that they have independently found the vulnerability and autonomously develop the related technology. Furthermore, we don't want them to be employed by the affected software makers. We don't want them to have received confidential information through disclosure by the same. All of which is to say that I don't want the employee or software maker or the affected software maker to write themselves a new minivan tonight, right? Principle C is about avoiding conflict of interest. We should strive to benefit those we do business with, of course. And this applies at company level, employee, and contractors alike. In particular, the private sector should protect the value of the trade capabilities and specify the maximum number of times the same capability will be sold within a given time period, unless the same capability is intended for risk prevention purposes. Furthermore, we shall strive not to sell the vulnerability to one party and the technology to defend against the same vulnerability to another party that is likely to be the target or the first. Standard 5 is about controlling the intended and unintended use. And we should prohibit ourselves, our employee and contractors, to use information capabilities traded in the fulfillment of the service in order to pursue personal goals. Authorized personnel should use the vulnerability information only for testing and validation purposes, and more generally for research and development. And more generally, we should decouple in a very neat and strict way the research and development of those capabilities from computer network operation, and never confuse the two. Sure enough, we need to obey the law, all applicable law. Especially, we should comply with trade laws controlling where we can send our capabilities and services. and strive to meet all the criteria required to hold export licenses where applicable, and stay alert to change to the applicable export licensing system, which is not to say that trade controls are necessarily a good idea in this field, because we are facing usage-related challenges that should not be addressed with export control, in my humble opinion. Of course, confidentiality is of essence. Here, confidentiality needs to be understood as both the confidentiality of our business partners, as well as the confidentiality of the vulnerability information we exchange, receive from our suppliers, and provide to our customer. For this reason, I restrict access to the information and the intellectual property received from or provided to my business partners on a need-to-know basis, enforcing a principle of least privilege. And finally, there is a fallback mechanism. Finally, there is a default policy that the technologists among you will recognize as a default accept. And this principle is contributed by the doctrine of double effect. Essentially, what I'm doing here is to acknowledge that the capabilities I provide may be used within goods that, just like all information security tools, are inherently dual purpose and potentially dual use, and therefore may serve also military purposes, police investigation, and alike. The military use of the trade capabilities may have a double effect, an intended effect and a foreseen but genuinely unintended consequence. So while discouraging against harmful side effects of these capabilities, I accept to trade them as long as they are not in conflict with the other principles and standards set forth in the present Code of Ethics. Standard number 8 is about enforcing this principle. And it's pretty much it as far as my Code of Ethics goes. So concluding, today I'm honored to be back in Singapore with you. I'm reminded about the Russian-born Aliza Zinoyevna Rosenbaum, also known as Ayn Rand, who once remarked, every aspect of the Western culture needs a new code of ethics, a rational ethics as a precondition of rebirth. I feel similarly with regard to the debate surrounding vulnerabilities. Every aspect of the vulnerability supply chain needs a new code of ethics, a rational ethics as a precondition of rebirth. In this spirit, I established the first code of ethics focused on the trade of vulnerability information, and today I offer its principles and standards up for comments and criticism. As noted by Ed Warrant, a jurist in the United States, in a civilized life, law floats in a sea of ethics. It's both my hope and wish that our reflection will inform policymakers. As recently remarked by Stephen Aftergood on Nature, expanding the scope of ethical deliberation over new technology may seem like a daunting prospect bound to impede innovation. Today, there is no doubt that I raise questions more quickly than they can be answered. But experience suggests that many such questions will be worth asking. I welcome all your thoughts. Thank you.
Okay, so
any questions?
Questions from the floor? Any questions? Please feel free to.
Interesting talk about code of ethics for the private sector. So my question is, I think majority of the private sector, whenever they have vulnerability that they found, researchers, they usually disclose it or make it public. However, do we have code of ethics for government then? Because most of the time, governments themselves or nation state, they actually do research about vulnerabilities and they keep it to themselves. And most of the time they use it against others rather than just disclosing it to the public. So like, for example, the NSA leak, multiple 0 days were actually being leaked out. Stuxnet, Duku, Flame are all using 0 days based on government research and attacking another nation state country. So while I agree that code of ethics must be applied to private researchers or private companies, my question is, what do you think about the code of ethics that needs to be applied for government sectors as well?
This, speaking about governance and self-governance, it's a really hot topic nowadays. I'm focused on the private sector because I have control over this, being an active actor of the industry. At the government level, entities involved with the computer network operation, while facing the same ethical dilemmas, may approach those in a different way. Because if we are speaking about computer network exploitation, we are speaking about espionage, essentially, which is not unlawful from the public international law perspective. So I'm not sure how they are going to approach these aspects. Differently for law enforcement activities, leveraging security capabilities for investigation purpose. Sure enough, what I do in order to enforce the code of ethics for the private sector is to reflect the existence of this code of ethics in all the paperwork I exchange with both my suppliers and clients. So I ask them to abide to the principle and standards set forth in the same code of ethics. And as per me, as per my company, I retain the right to suspend or cease business operation in case of breach or the same ethical principle. So if they want to sustain our business partnership, they need to abide also to the same code of ethics. Of course, I may defect in terms of information from what's going on because I'm not into the operation. I don't know how they're going to use these capabilities. So I welcome also leakers and whistleblowers willing to tell me more proof and provide more evidence about what's going on. This is part of what I'm trying to do in order to enforce this code of ethics.
Sure, thank you.
Okay, so any more questions? All right, so if there's no, then thank you, Alfonso.
Thank you.
And we are going to have a coffee break from now, and the next talk will be